I remember the night before it began, the streets empty, and the wind caught in the chimneys of Salem as if the town itself was holding its breath. The windows of my house were dim, lamplight trembling across the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. Outside, the cobblestones glistened wet, though I cannot recall if rain had fallen or if it was the residue of tears long shed. In the kitchen, a single teacup sat upside down on the table, its porcelain chipped, holding the memory of dinners that would never be shared again. I sat by the hearth, my hands resting on the ledger that recorded every debt, every promise and every slight that I had committed or allowed. The fire flickered unevenly, and in its light I saw my own reflection in the darkened glass of the window, hollow-eyed and gaunt. I was alone, yet the house carried the weight of every whisper, every sigh that had ever passed through its halls. A strange image lingered in my mind, a small pair of shoes too tiny for any living child, placed in the corner as though they had always belonged there, waiting. I did not know why I remembered them now, but I did, and the memory gnawed at me as if it demanded confession. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. I was 47 then, already burdened with the care of my late husband's debts and the parish's suspicion. Yet that night I felt the weight of another secret pressing against my chest. I could hear nothing but the quiet, and yet it was not empty. I had hummed with a promise I could not name, a truth I had buried beneath layers of obedience, fear, and prayer. I had been a widow long enough to know the world in its cruel honesty, yet some things even I had never dared to face. In the study, letters from men I had trusted lay open. The ink faded, the words almost invisible, but they carried a message I could never ignore. The arrangements they spoke of were not of coin or land, but of flesh and lineage, a pact made in the shadows of Salem's facades. It was whispered, never spoken, but I had seen it. And now, decades later, I confess to it. Though I am the last to remember, the last to hold the weight of what was done, I remember that silence more than I remember her face. By the hearth, I touched the small chest of papers that contained the names, the dates, the contracts that no one would ever read. And yet I could not close it. My hand trembled, not from age alone, but from the horror of memory. I could feel the walls breathing, the wood groaning beneath sins that were not entirely mine, yet mine to witness, mine to recount. I thought of the women who had vanished quietly, the children whose names were never spoken again. I was meant to forget, but forgetting had never been permitted. The shadows in the corners seemed to lean closer, as if the house itself wanted me to speak, to bear witness. And so I began slowly, cautiously, as if each word might undo me entirely. I had loved and lost, feared and hidden, and yet the ledger of my soul demanded its recounting. I had hidden beneath the weight of pious obligation, yet the truth lingered alive, demanding to be named. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. There were nights I walked the streets, pretending to check on the hearths, pretending to hear the bells of the old chapel, yet always feeling the eyes of the absent upon me. Each shuttered window seemed to carry a memory, each step on the cobblestone a reminder that some sins do not die, that some shadows cannot be soothed by candlelight or prayer. I was witness to what should not have been witnessed, guardian of the unspoken, and still I had no courage to speak. I remember that silence more than I remember her face, and it was then I realized that the fire I feared was not the fire of flame, but the fire that would come from memory, that would consume me long before any hearth could burn. I did not pray for forgiveness nor for mercy, only for the chance to tell it once, before I was swallowed entirely by years of waiting, of watching, and of knowing. I remember that silence more than I remember her face, and as the night pressed closer, as the candles guttered, and the wind whispered through the narrow streets, I spoke my first word, trembling, hesitant, yet certain. The confession had begun, and I, Harriet Lowen, widow of Salem, would speak, though God and man alike might turn away. and it was then I realized that the watching had never ended. The morning arrived grey and hesitant, the sunlight failing to warm the damp streets of Salem. I remember walking slowly past the parish, noting how the stones themselves seemed older, weary of the sins they had seen, and I felt a kinship with them. My shoes clicked softly against the cobbles, each step stirring memories I had long tried to lock away. Mothers leaning from windows with weary eyes, men huddled in doorways, their faces etched with suspicion or shame. It was a town alive with whispers, though none spoke aloud what we all knew. I entered my small study. The ledger opened before me, its pages yellowed and delicate. I ran my finger along the lines, counting names that had no place in daylight. Children promised, sold, arranged like livestock in quiet rooms, hidden beneath the manor floorboards. I had learned to keep my gaze steady, but the memory of those small faces, eyes wide with trust and innocence, tore at the corners of my mind. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. It was Father Whitmore who had first asked questions, politely, carefully, yet with the insistence of one who already suspected. He did not need to speak in loud tones. The weight of his gaze alone carried judgment. I nodded, spoke in hushed tones, but in my heart I refused him the truth. I had seen enough of God's anger to know that confession might demand blood I could not give. And yet the ledger called me, the names haunted me, and I knew I could no longer remain silent. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. The kitchen remained untouched since the night before, teacup upside down, a thin film of dust settling over its chipped rim. I had left it deliberately, as though a pause in action might preserve my resolve. Outside, the fog lingered in the alleys, thickening around the corners, turning familiar shapes into phantoms. The smell of damp wood and stale air crept through the house, reminding me of what had been buried, hidden, forgotten. And yet I could not bury the memory, for it followed me like a shadow that refused the light. I spoke then to the empty room, whispering names aloud, testing my own courage. Mary Eliza Thomas. Names of children whose lives had been curtailed before their stories could unfold. And I had known it, had seen it, had consented in silence while the arrangements were made in darkened chambers where the parishioners never went. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. In the afternoon I visited the chapel. Its windows were streaked with rain and time, the pews rough and worn beneath the hands of countless sinners and saints alike. I touched the carved wood as though it might speak to me, as though it might confess the sins of all who had knelt there before me. The air was cold, carrying the faint scent of wax and dust, and I shivered, not from the cold but from the awareness that I had been a witness, a participant in a quiet horror that no sermon would ever condemn. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. Returning home, I found the servants whispering among themselves, casting cautious glances toward me. I could feel their unease, the subtle accusation in their tone. They had guessed, I thought, though none would dare speak it outright. The walls seemed to lean closer, as if the house itself was pressing for acknowledgement, demanding that the ledger be opened, that the truth be named. And still I hesitated, held back by the weight of my own mortality, by the fear that the story would end with me, unanswered and unatoned. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. Evening approached with a hesitant sigh, the sky dimming to a washed grey, and I lit the candles one by one, their flickering light casting trembling shadows along the walls. Each shadow seemed to hold a memory, each flame a whisper of what had been done, and each moment of silence grew heavier, pressing against my chest. I sat by the hearth, the ledger open, my hand hovering over its pages, and I realized that I had already begun to confess, though no voice had yet left my lips. I remember that silence more than I remember her face, and in that quiet, I understood that the watching continued. Every corner of Salem held its witness, every street and shuttered window remembering the sins of decades past. And I, Harriet Lowen, widow of Salem, would carry this knowledge until the very end, speaking only when I could no longer hold it within, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that the act of telling might lighten the burden, even if only by a fraction, and it was then I realized the ledger had never forgotten a single name. The morning arrived in a muted haze, the fog drifting low along the cobblestones and curling around the wrought-iron fences that lined the streets of Salem. I walked slowly past the abandoned market stalls, their boards warped and cracked from years of neglect, and I felt the city's memory pressing against my chest. Each doorway, each shuttered window, seemed to hold its own secret. I could hear the echoes of footsteps long gone, the whispers of mothers mourning children they had never held, the sighs of men who had bargained with promises they could not keep. I returned to my manor, its walls sagging under the weight of time, the roof sagging as though it carried the burden of decades. The hallway stretched before me, lined with portraits whose eyes followed me relentlessly. I remembered the children, 13 of them, each promised to the arrangements that had been set by hands both gentle and cruel. They had smiled, I recalled, their eyes full of trust, unaware of the cruel calculations that decided their fates. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. At the study, the ledger awaited me. I had tried to resist, leaving it closed for weeks, but the names called insistently. Each entry marked a life that had been claimed in secret, each signature a witness to a crime I had neither created nor prevented with enough courage. The ink was faded, but the weight of the words pressed against my chest. I read slowly, deliberately, remembering the faces of the children, the warmth of their tiny hands, the laughter that had been stolen before it could bloom. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. I went to the nursery, now empty, the cradle still rocking gently from some unseen hand or lingering memory. Dust covered the floorboards and the wallpaper had peeled, revealing years of decay beneath. I touched the smooth wood of the crib, imagining the weight of the children who had lain there. I remembered the way they had clung to me with innocent faith, and the horror of the arrangements that had taken them away. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. The afternoon brought shadows, long and dark, stretching across the courtyard as the sun faded behind heavy clouds. I wandered past the garden, overgrown with weeds, the flowers dead or dying. In their place, small bones had been hidden beneath the soil, reminders of promises broken and innocence betrayed. I felt the earth pressing against my feet, cold and unyielding, as though it were aware of the sins buried within it. And I could not look away, could not resist the pull of memory that demanded I remember every detail, every face. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. I visited the parish again, seeking guidance I knew I would not find. Father Whitmore's eyes, though kind, bore the weight of suspicion. I spoke of mundane things, of weather and town news, but he listened for the tremor beneath my words. I knew he had already sensed the truth, had glimpsed the ledger in my hands, and yet he said nothing. I understood then that some truths were too heavy for speech, that some sins must linger, unspoken, to haunt the living as well as the dead. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. Evening settled over the manor with a slow, oppressive gloom. The lamplight flickered weakly against the walls, trembling like a candle afraid to bear witness. I lit them carefully, each flame a fragile attempt to hold back the dark. The shadows stretched and twisted across the room, forming shapes that resembled the children, reaching for me with empty eyes and silent cries. I could feel their presence not as spectres, but as the unbearable weight of memory itself. I remember that silence more than I remember her face, and in that dim light, I opened the ledger once more, my hands shaking. I traced the names with a finger that trembled with age and guilt. Each letter seemed to pulse a heartbeat in the darkness. I understood fully then that the children, the agreements, the secret arrangements, they were all a part of me now, as inseparable as my own shadow. And I knew I could never close this chapter, never erase what had been done. And it was then I realized that the walls of Salem itself remembered more than I ever could. The following days were cloaked in a heavy, unrelenting fog, and even the sunlight that dared to pierce the sky seemed dimmed by some unseen hand. The manor groaned with age, each floorboard and rafter a reminder of time's slow, remorseless decay. I wandered through the hallways, my eyes tracing the peeling wallpaper and the cracked plaster, noting how the rooms themselves seemed to lean inward, listening, remembering, carrying the echoes of choices long past. I could feel the weight of the pact pressing upon me still, as if the walls themselves bore witness to what I had witnessed and failed to prevent. I remembered the servants, their faces pale and sallow, bearing the burdens of secrets they were not permitted to share. I recalled the way they looked at the children, eyes full of sorrowful knowledge, understanding the horrors that would unfold without ever daring to speak. And in that silence, I felt the town's collective guilt pressing through the doors, through the shutters, pressing into my chest like the hands of those whose lives had been controlled by forces they did not understand. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. The nursery, once a place of soft lullabies and tender whispers, had become a chamber of quiet accusation. The crib remained unoccupied, yet I sensed the emptiness as something alive, a weight that pressed on my chest. I traced my fingers along its edges, recalling the laughter that had once echoed there, now replaced by the lingering memory of what had been taken. The small bones hidden beneath the floorboards seemed to breathe beneath my touch, and I could not stop imagining the eyes of the children, wide and unblinking, staring from the shadows. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. I visited the town's church again, seeking solace I knew I would not find. Father Whitmore moved among the pews, reciting prayers that seemed to fall flat against the thick air, as if the very walls of the parish had absorbed every whisper of wrongdoing over decades. I lingered in the back watching him, wondering if he sensed the truth of my guilt, or if he too had turned away from what could not be spoken aloud. My hands trembled against the wooden pews, feeling the polished surface smooth beneath the roughness of my calloused skin, and I realized the church had become an accomplice in silence. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. Evening brought a damp chill that seeped through the manor's windows, curling around my feet, and I found myself in the garden once more. The weeds had grown tall, entangling themselves with the flowers that refused to bloom. The soil, dark and heavy, held the weight of secrets that had been buried without ceremony, each mound a silent testament to decisions made by hands that should have known better. My boots pressed into the cold earth, leaving shallow impressions that were quickly swallowed, and I felt as though I were walking atop lives I had helped condemn. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. At night, I returned to the study, where the ledger waited as always. I opened it with care, tracing names and dates as if the act itself might conjure some forgotten mercy. Each entry was a stitch in the fabric of my remorse, binding me to memories I could neither erase nor forgive. I could almost hear the soft breathing of the children, the way they might have whispered my name in trust, only to find their world reshaped by cold, merciless calculations. I remember that silence more than I remember her face, and as the candlelight trembled across the pages, I realized that the horror of the mulberry plantation pact had taken root not just in the earth or the ledger, but in me. It was a weight I carried in my chest, in my hands, in the hollows of my eyes, and it was then I realized that the town itself had become a mirror of my own failing, each street and house a reflection of the sins we all bore in silence. The mornings grew colder still, and the frost seemed to cling to the edges of the manor, like some obstinate memory refusing to die. I would step onto the veranda, each breath misting before me, watching the fields beyond where the earth had been disturbed too many times to count. There was a symmetry to the rows of trees, almost mocking in their order, yet beneath them lay the chaos of our sins, neatly hidden from the casual observer, but unmistakable to those who had seen too much. I traced the outlines of each knotted branch, thinking of the lives that had been bent and broken, and wondered if the sky above had noticed our transgressions. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. The servants moved through their routines with a mechanical precision, faces pale, as though they had inhaled the guilt that saturated every brick of the manor. They carried baskets of laundry, stacked dishes and swept the floors, all while keeping the shadows at bay with their quiet obedience. I saw in them the same knowledge I could not share, the understanding that some acts could not be atoned for, and that the children, whose laughter once filled these halls, had become ghosts before their time. Every corner of the house whispered of this, the air heavy with things unspoken, and I could feel the weight pressing upon my shoulders, urging me to speak, yet forbidding me from revealing the full horror. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. By midday, the sun fought a losing battle against the clouded sky, and the garden seemed to droop beneath the weight of its own neglect. I walked among the weeds, noting the flowers that had stubbornly survived, fragile and defiant, and wondered if they sensed the presence of what had been hidden beneath the soil. My hands traced the rough bark of a mulberry tree, and I imagined the children beneath its shadow, their small forms concealed from the eyes of a world that had chosen to look away. Each leaf trembled in the faint breeze, as if recalling the whispers of lives that had been claimed too soon, and I felt a chill run through me, deeper than any winter cold. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. The ledger remained in my study, open to pages that I had grown to know by heart, yet each time I stared upon it, the ink seemed to shift, forming shapes that suggested not numbers, but names I could barely speak aloud. I would run my fingers over the scrawled letters, and a tremor would pass through my chest, as though the ghosts of those long gone sought to remind me of my complicity. I recalled Father Whitmore's sermons, once a balm for the restless soul, now hollow in their repetition. The prayers, the hymns, all failed to penetrate the thickening air of remorse that clung to my lungs. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. Evening descended, and I found myself again in the nursery, staring at the empty cribs. The shadows of the past seemed to gather there, pooling in the corners where the moonlight dared not reach. I could feel the weight of their absence pressing into the floorboards, the faint depressions in the wood that marked where small bodies had lain, and the air was thick with the memory of breaths that had never been drawn fully. I pressed my palm against the cold wood, feeling the pulse of history beneath my hand, and a tear slid down my cheek as I realized the full measure of what had been taken from us. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. Night came with its oppressive quiet, the candlelight flickering as if reluctant to bear witness to what I had seen. I closed the ledger for the night, the act feeling both futile and necessary, and I retreated to my chamber, where I stared at the ceiling as though it could offer answers that the world had denied me. The weight of unspoken truths pressed into every bone, every sinew, until sleep itself felt like a betrayal, a surrender to the very guilt that kept me awake. And it was then I realized that no amount of hiding or forgetting could release me from what had been sown into the soil, into the house and into my own flesh. The air had grown damp with the approaching storm, though the clouds themselves seemed too heavy to move. I walked the hallways of the manor, my steps muffled by the thick, worn rugs, each footfall a whisper against the weight of memory. Portraits of ancestors glared down at me with solemn eyes, their painted faces frozen in judgment, as if the walls themselves were alive with accusation. The chandelier swung slightly, catching the lamplight in fractured reflections that danced across the ceiling like the fleeting shapes of the dead. I traced the edges of the paintings, noting the gloss of varnish that trapped decades of dust and silence. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. The servants, though diligent, moved with a caution I had never seen before. It was as though the house itself dictated their movements, urging them to tread lightly across spaces that held the echo of horrors unspoken. I saw them glance toward the nursery with subtle trepidation, averted eyes, hands clenched to baskets or brooms as though the very act of witnessing might summon the past to life. And I understood fully that what lay buried in the soil beneath the mulberry tree was no longer hidden. It existed in the air between us, in the way the floorboards groaned under the weight of unremembered steps. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. By afternoon, the storm had begun its slow descent, a faint drizzle tapping against the panes of glass, each droplet an insistence of nature upon the house. I ventured into the garden, my coat clinging damply to my body, and I observed the earth that had been disturbed too often to be accidental. Beneath the roots of the older trees, there were places where the soil remained dark and loose, as though it had been tended with care for reasons other than cultivation. I knelt and pressed my hand to the ground, feeling the cool, shifting soil beneath my palm, and I shivered, not from cold, but from recognition of the depths of the pact that had been made here. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. Evening arrived with a suffocating fog that rolled through the courtyard, muffling the carriage wheels and dimming the glow of the gas lamps. I found myself in the chapel alone, the pews lined with dust and the scent of candle wax heavy in the air. I traced my fingers along the carved wood of the altar, imagining the prayers that had once been whispered here, now swallowed by the rot of years. The shadows stretched and coiled around the corners, thick and patient, as though they waited for me to confess in full. And I knew as I knelt there that some sins were too profound for absolution. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. Night fell fully, and I returned to my chamber, the rain outside now a relentless curtain against the windows. The ledger lay open, its pages dark with ink, listing names and deeds that had been committed in the hush of complicity. I traced the scrawled lines with trembling fingers, the letters swimming before my eyes, forming shapes I could not name aloud. I thought of Harriet, of the children, of the unbroken chain of decisions that had led to this place of despair. And it was then I realized that even as the candles burned down to their last flicker, the truth remained alive, pressing into the corners of the house, into the boards beneath my feet, and into the very marrow of my bones. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. The house had become a tomb in its own right, every room thick with the weight of unspoken acts. I moved through the hallways as if wading through water, my footsteps stirring ghosts I had long tried to ignore. The windows, fogged with condensation, reflected a world that seemed both familiar and alien, as though the house had shifted while I slept, rearranging its chambers to guard its secrets. I paused at the threshold of the nursery, the door swollen with damp and age, and felt a tightening in my chest, a memory clawing to the surface, unbidden and relentless. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. In that room, the faint scent of cedar and decayed linen hung in the air, the remnants of cradles and forgotten toys, whispering of lives extinguished before they had truly begun. My hands, trembling with years of guilt, reached for the window frame, tracing the grooves worn into the wood by small fingers that would never grasp the world. The portraits of children, painted, preserved, stared at me with eyes that seemed too knowing, too aware, accusing me silently for the pacts made and the bargains kept. I could almost hear the soft footsteps of those lost within the walls, though none had ever walked again. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to embers, yet I could not leave it alone. I fed it scraps of paper, letters, deeds, ledgers, anything that bore witness to the arrangements and arrangements undone. Each page ignited with a small flare, illuminating my gaunt reflection in the soot-streaked mirror, a face older and more hollow than I could bear to recognize. And with each flare the shadows of the room deepened, folding into corners where the eyes of the dead seemed to gather, patient and unrelenting. The pact, once made with whispered consent and trembling hands, now roared within me like a bell that would never cease. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. Evening fell with a heavy gloom, The sky pressed low against the horizon, grey and unyielding. I wandered to the orchard beyond the manor, where the mulberry trees bent beneath the weight of dark fruit, their roots knotted above places I dared not unearth. The soil was soft in places, disturbed by hands I could no longer name. Yet instinct told me where the truth slumbered, hidden beneath layers of earth and silence. I dropped to my knees, my palms pressed to the damp ground, and felt the pulse of what I had buried decades ago, a heartbeat I could never reconcile with my own. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. Night encroached fully, and I returned to the chapel, where the air was thick with the scent of extinguished candles and disuse. Kneeling before the altar, I traced the carvings with shaking fingers, following the lines of saints who had long since turned their gaze from my sins. The confessions I had written and rewritten, the prayers muttered in the dark, the whispered apologies that never found ears, all converged in that single moment, a weight beyond redemption. And it was then I realized that the knocking I had long feared had never ceased. It echoed beneath the floorboards behind every door, and within the chambers of my own chest, relentless and patient, reminding me that some truths remain unburied only to haunt forever. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. The walls of the manor seemed to breathe with a slow, deliberate exhale, carrying with them the weight of decades I had tried in vain to forget. I walked through the corridors, each step a testament to my own failing memory, as if the house itself conspired to keep me tethered to the past. The floorboards creaked under my hesitant weight, groaning beneath the accumulated sins they had silently witnessed, and I felt a trembling in my bones that no fire or lamp could warm. The furniture sagged as though burdened by invisible bodies, the upholstery faded, threadbare, bearing the imprints of hands and knees long vanished from this world. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. In the nursery, dust lay thick over the remnants of small beds, each mattress a grave for a life that barely began. The toys, carved and painted with care, stared back at me with eyes that were not mine to judge, but that seemed to pierce my very soul. I touched a tiny chair, worn smooth where a child's weight had pressed, and felt the shudder of memory rise unbidden. It was not her presence I sensed, nor that of the others who had suffered here. It was the weight of complicity, the unbearable heaviness of knowing that I had witnessed and allowed. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. The letters and ledgers I had destroyed weeks prior still haunted me, inked pages of transactions and agreements that defined lives, reduced to numbers and hushed whispers. Each document I burned felt simultaneously purifying and damning, the flames illuminating the hollows of my own reflection. So I saw then with cruel clarity how I had betrayed not only the innocent but the very essence of my own soul. And in that reflection, the figure of a man I barely recognized, a frail, trembling shadow, stared back with eyes rimmed with the red of night spent awake, haunted by choices that could not be unmade. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. Beyond the manor, the orchard lay in quiet despair, the mulberry trees bending under their own dark fruit, their roots tangled and knotted like the web of sin they had shielded for decades. I knelt in the soft earth once more, pressing my fingers into soil that had drunk the memory of what I had hidden beneath it, and felt a pulse that was not mine, a reminder that some truths refuse to sleep no matter how carefully they are buried. The wind carried a chill that seemed almost deliberate, teasing my senses, reminding me that the world outside was patient, but never forgiving. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. Returning to the chapel, I found the pews vacant, yet the air was thick with the echoes of prayers I had failed to offer, and hymns I had left incomplete. I knelt again before the altar, my hands tracing the worn wood, and felt the hollowness of every confession I had muttered in darkness. My heart thudded with a dread I could not escape, and it was then I realized that the shadows I had thought were gone had only been waiting, patient and eternal. And it was in that moment, in that suffocating stillness, that I understood some sins do not end. They merely sleep, until memory forces them awake once more. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. The candlelight flickered across the study, casting fractured shadows that danced upon the walls, as though alive with the memories I had tried to hide. I ran my fingers over the ledger once more, tracing the names of children I had seen vanish into the night, their faces etched into my mind like scars that refused to fade. Each name carried the weight of my cowardice, the timbre of my silence, and I felt a trembling in my chest that no prayer could quell. I had spent decades convincing myself that distance could absolve me, that time could bury guilt, but the truth clung with a persistence that neither candle nor shadow could obscure. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. I wandered the corridors again, and the manor groaned as if in warning, each shutter rattling faintly in the morning breeze that crept through cracked panes. The air was damp, scented with rot and dust, the kind of decay that seeps into your bones until it feels like part of you. I paused by a broken mirror, catching a glimpse of my own face, hollowed, lined, a reflection not only of age but of the years spent hiding, lying, and watching. My own eyes seemed foreign to me, strangers who knew the truth my tongue refused to speak. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. In the nursery, the small chairs and cradles remained worn and abandoned. I knelt beside them and traced the etchings my hands had made decades ago, reminders of moments I wished I could unsee. I remembered the whispered promises, the instructions I had carried from one room to another, never daring to question them. The weight of those actions pressed upon me, relentless, a tide that refused to recede. I had told myself I did what was necessary, that obedience was duty. But now each thought revealed itself as complicity, each memory a small funeral for my own soul. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. The orchard lay beyond, the trees heavy and stooped, their dark fruit rotting upon the ground, a testament to years of neglect and hidden sins. I wandered among them, hands brushing against the twisted roots, and felt the pulse of the earth beneath me, thick with everything I had buried and denied. It was here I confronted the truth that no ledger, no locked door, no hidden grave could contain. Some deeds live in the soil, in the air, in the marrow of those who witness them. And I had been a witness. I had been silent. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. Returning to the attic, I found the trunks I had sealed so carefully, filled with papers and belongings that spoke of life, of innocence lost, of choices made under the guise of protection. Each trunk I opened revealed fragments of humanity I had helped destroy. And it was then I realized the horror was not the fire that would one day consume all this. It was that the weight of knowledge, of memory, of truth would not be extinguished, and that I would carry it with me, until breath left my body and the walls forgot my name. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. The morning light came weakly through the grime-coated windows, casting a pale, sickly glow upon the remnants of my life. The manor seemed smaller now, as if it had shrunk around the enormity of my guilt. Every corner, every shadow, whispered the memories I had tried to suppress for decades. I moved from room to room, tracing the faded wallpaper, the warped floorboards, the cracked glass of mirrors that held not only my reflection, but the faces of those I had failed. I could feel the years pressing down on me like a hand I could not remove, the weight of all I had witnessed and all I had done. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. In the nursery, the cradles remained empty, the toys dust-covered and still. I ran my hand over a small rocking horse, worn smooth by generations, and felt the echo of small feet that would never return. Every corner of the room seemed to breathe with the lives that had passed through it, their laughter stolen, their cries unheard, their innocence corroded by decisions I had made in the name of survival, obedience, and fear. I had told myself my actions were necessary, that mercy was preserved in secrecy, yet now the truth pressed against me, naked and relentless, I remember that silence more than I remember her face. I descended to the cellar, the steps groaning beneath my careful weight. Here lay the final remnants, hidden beneath the floorboards for so long that I had begun to believe they were gone, lost to time. But the scent of earth, decay, and regret was inescapable. I knelt, uncovering the hidden truth I had spent a lifetime avoiding. Names, faces, small items, all the proof of what I had seen, what I had allowed, what I had helped enact. The air felt thick with accusation, and my hands trembled as if even they could not bear the confession. I realized then that no lock, no ledger, no hidden corner could contain what I had carried in my soul. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. I lit the last candle in the hall, its flame flickering as if frightened by the enormity of my memory. I walked through the empty rooms, touching walls, doors, and the fragments of life left behind, and understood that the true fire had never been in the hearth, nor would it ever be. It was in me, in the marrow of my bones, in the tremble of my hands, in the broken cadence of my breath. Every corner of the manor, every shadowed hallway bore witness to what I had seen and what I had concealed, and I realized with a clarity that almost stole my breath. The fire that would one day consume the house could not burn the truth that lived within me. I remember that silence more than I remember her face. I descended into the orchard one last time. The trees were skeletal now, their fruit long rotted, the soil damp with years of rain and neglect. And beneath that earth lay the secrets of a lifetime, the proof of innocence stolen, of lives altered forever, of the silent complicity of my own hands. I knelt and pressed my palm to the cold ground, feeling the weight of history, of my failure, of my cowardice pressing up against me. Time had not healed, nor had distance forgotten. It was then I realized the knocking had never truly stopped. I rose slowly, my body stiff with age and remorse, and for the first time I saw the manor as it truly was, a mausoleum not of bodies but of memory. I understood that my confession would not absolve me, that no candle, no ledger, no whispered prayer could undo what had been done. I had been a witness. I had been a keeper of silence. And now as I breathed my final acknowledgement into the cold morning air, I knew that some truths do not end, they linger, as indelible as the shadows across the walls, waiting for someone else to remember what I had long feared to name. And it was then I realized the knocking had never truly stopped.